Signal Sciences secures the most important web applications, APIs, and microservices of the world's leading companies, protecting over 7,500 applications and 150 billion production requests per week. Signal Sciences Next-Gen WAF and RASP help companies increase security and maintain site reliability without sacrificing velocity, all at the lowest total cost of ownership. Signal Sciences' patented technology protects any application against any attack, with integrations into any DevOps toolchain. Signal Sciences, demand more from your WAF. Learn more at signalsciences.com/PSW. Let the team at Black Hills Information Security test your defenses. With over 10 years of experience in penetration testing, red teaming, and threat hunting, the testers at Black Hills will help you find the holes in your security before the bad guys do. The team at Black Hills cares about educating and sharing their knowledge by creating countless blogs, open source tools, and webcasts for you to learn more about the tradecraft of pen testing and red teaming. Visit securityweekly.com/BHIS to join their mailing list and view the latest blogs and webcasts from Black Hills Information Security. Effectively securing your organization and its reputation requires a smarter approach. To maximize efficiency and minimize risk, security experts turn to LogRhythm, the only leading solution built solely for security teams by a security team committed to your success. With Next-Gen SIEM, user and entity behavior analytics, network traffic and behavior analysis, security automation and orchestration, and compliance, LogRhythm provides security made smarter. Welcome back, everyone, to Enterprise Security Weekly. Do we have announcements in this one? There's one more announcement. There it is. Attending KubeCon and Cloud Native Con in Europe 2019 in Barcelona, May 20th through the 23rd. Join your peers at the Cloud Native Transformation Summit 2019, hosted by Sysdig on May 20th. Sysdig is a sponsor of the network, and our very own Matt Alderman will be emceeing the event. Pre-registration is required. You can add it to your KubeCon and Cloud Native Con registration, so you should do that. Awesome. Alrighty. In the news this week, ThreatConnect has added new features, making it essentially easier and more efficient to create playbooks for its users. I think this is a trend that I like seeing in security. I think the tools are becoming a lot more usable. We're realizing with the reports are like there's 1 million to 2 million open jobs in cybersecurity today in the world. And I think to address some of those issues, software vendors are trying to make it easier for us to delegate certain tasks down to folks like help desk, operations, right? Because there's just not enough security people to go around. We need to enable IT admin, people that don't carry security in their title, essentially, to be able to do some of this work. And that brings me to ThreatConnect's feature, right? Basically, you're creating playbooks, right? And they're doing that with a built-in debugger now that can use code, debug, and release without setting up a separate environment. They've also got version control built into your playbooks. So they're just they're treating a playbook more like software and enabling it for people that, maybe they know a little bit about coding, but they want to go create playbooks and basically not screw it up and have version control and all these different things. So I thought that was really, really cool.
That's interesting.
ThreatConnect's part. They've intelligence vendor that they've very much integrated the SOAR component into their product. That was something they kind of announced a couple of years ago and are moving forward with. So let's see. Security Innovation is delivering expert blockchain training at BlackHat USA. I thought that was interesting. We haven't talked about blockchain in a while. I like to see blockchain technologies as they relate to improving business operations and security of an organization, not so much to cryptocurrency, right? So it's interesting to see this training at BlackHat.
Yeah, I haven't seen a lot of training with regards to blockchain, so that's definitely an interesting one that take a look at.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the interesting things I bet they cover is that I was reading about some compromises on blockchain because the cryptocurrencies guys invented their own crypto instead of using something standard that was strong. I mean, it's a lesson I guess we need to keep learning, that you don't go roll your own crypto.
Exactly. Yeah, Sharon Goldberg described some of the vulnerabilities a year ago or so on the show, on Business Security Weekly, actually, and it was really awesome. I did not know that some of the vulnerabilities did extend back to they basically invented their own crypto. They certainly invented new protocols and software, right, which inherently is when you first create it, right, largely untested. So there have been a lot of vulnerabilities that have been disclosed and subsequently fixed. We don't cover a lot of them here on the show, as most of them relate to cryptocurrency, which isn't exactly security, right? Let's see. SolarWinds has acquired a password management as a service vendor in an acquisition this week. They launched the SolarWinds Passportal Suite, unified set of password management and privileged client knowledge management tools to add to its gigantic portfolio of tools offered by SolarWinds. They're aiming to effectively manage and secure a broad range of IT ecosystems, and now with password management, which I really think in enterprises today, we've talked about this on shows recently, like managing credentials and authentication is
critical.
Even more critical than ever before in our environment, right? I mean, you see it on pen test, right?
All the time.
Most of the time as pen testers, we're just taking advantage of poor authentication, misuse of credentials.
Or these portals where they don't support two-factor, or you implement two-factor, but you do it wrong, or you enable a static key, or
two-factor isn't everywhere on every application. Is oftentimes John Strand will tell me that's the downfall, is they feel secure because we've got two-factor, but the API isn't implementing two-factor, or this other application in a web app versus a full client, the web app is in two-factor. There's all kinds of scenarios that lend itself to that.
Definitely things to consider when thinking about and looking at password management solutions, especially for these service accounts, and managing that appropriately. It's definitely an important space. So
there's a lot of great innovation too, and I've got some notes on some briefings that will air on future episodes where they've removed the password completely. Like basically on your phone, which that part kind of scares me, but put that aside for a moment. Using your phone, your smartphone, they can validate that it's you, generate a random password in the background, and that's your password. So, our traditional kind of password attacks don't work in that sense. Now, what's interesting yesterday is I covered a vulnerability in some Qualcomm chips that could allow an attacker to get access to the key store that's like a hardware protected key store on phones, which that's where your two-factor apps are storing stuff. That's where your Signal app is potentially, which I believe is storing stuff. Depends on the platform and the version in the phone you're using. So there was one vendor, I forget which one it was, but I'll cover it in the briefing. If your phone didn't have a fingerprint reader, they used a camera and you took a picture of your 4 fingers and they were able to read the fingerprints from it. So there's awesome innovations in this space, and I think it's something every organization should be looking at leveling up on, because it's really just about protecting the user and your data today.
Yeah, I would say the only thing that I would add to that might be your applications, and these service accounts that are sort of providing that data for you. Especially where credential theft is such a prevalent thing. We see it all the time, and so managing credentials couldn't be more important. And so definitely something that a lot of organizations should invest in. And sounds like there's a new player in the space doing some good stuff.
I think there's another aspect that would be useful for enterprises is also to invest in a enterprise password manager type solution to defray the yellow sticky complex, or putting them in a piece of paper in your wallet, because where you have reusable passwords, they should be well stored and managed.
I agree, Lee. I did flag an article for tomorrow that is arguing against using a password vault or manager, I should say, not vault, password manager. I haven't read it yet. I just kind of flagged it. I'm like, that might be an interesting viewpoint to consider. I'm a big fan of the password manager.
Yeah, especially where if you need to share credentials between individuals.
Yeah, it's the way to go.
What's the better alternative than some sort of secure password manager?
Right.
I mean, it's
Signal, right? Signal.
Yeah.
But you still, if someone gets access to your phone or some of the Signal desktop and browser add-ons, not so much the code in Signal as it was the way the browser or the Android environment treats that particular application made it vulnerable.
Mhm.
Signal's code was great, right? But the environments they're in allow for attackers to exploit some vulnerabilities.
It's the dependencies of that platform that.
So I agree. I think a
makes
password manager is the way to go.
For sure.
CyberX is applying some industrial IoT security inside of Palo Alto Networks Cortex. So I don't know if you followed this whole evolution, and on a future show, I really want to dig into it a little more. I wasn't able to research it completely for this show, and I haven't done a formal briefing. I did catch up with Palo Alto Cortex at InfoSec World. And you're looking at me like you have no idea what I'm talking about, Josh, which is my reaction too, because I went up to him like, your whole booth is branded Palo Alto Cortex. I'm like, what is going on? Essentially, Palo Alto has made a couple of internal software improvement or projects, right? So they've built some software in-house. They've made several acquisitions of technology over time. They've kind of branded all of this technology now under what they're calling Cortex, which is their new security platform, basically providing a lot of the functionality that came from a couple of internal projects. Is it Traps is their endpoint thing that they built in-house, I believe, and then they've made some other acquisitions, and we'll put all those pieces together. Now the Cortex, just like the Palo Alto kind of marketplace, right? Cortex has a marketplace. CyberX is inside of that marketplace, which I thought was interesting because it's an industrial IoT vendor, which is kind of interesting. Usually that sits typically in the operational technology, OT side of the house, right? So I thought that announcement was interesting for all of those reasons, largely because people see Cortex and they're like, what is that? So they got some branding to do. I'm happy to help them out, as I probably already did on the show by making people realize that, Cortex is where it came from at a very high level. I don't remember all Palo Alto's acquisitions off the top of my head. I should, but I don't.
There's so many that occur that, in the space and enterprise, it's
I need like a big, similar to like the genealogy of Unix and Linux, which I want that poster. If anyone knows where I can get that poster, I had terrible luck trying to find a place to purchase that poster, right? We need one for acquisitions in security.
It's crazy.
Right?
Yeah, it's crazy.
Hanging up here in the studio. Maybe even on set. That'd be cool.
You might have to update it daily.
Yes. It would need to be a digital signage, right? Beyond Trust did some research to discover that 81% of critical Microsoft vulnerabilities are mitigated by removing admin rights. Do you agree with this, Josh? Lee?
81%.
I'm not sure how they came.
I'm not sure. So you have remote vulns and you have local vulns, right? So the local vulns probably wouldn't need local admin for it.
They can get admin,
right? Or that would be the vulnerability.
Yep.
And then the remote ones wouldn't need it because you'd be on the network and you'd be able to talk to a remote system.
Right.
So I don't know if I guess I'll need to take a look at the research here, but I guess it surprises me that it's the critical vulnerabilities. I think that I agree that, removing admin rights is a good thing, and that's probably one of the best ways you can mitigate a large amount of the risk.
Absolutely.
I don't know if I would say right off the top of my head, based on my experiences, that 81%, maybe that's one to take a look at for sure.
That's the only.
This comes from the acquisition as well, because Beyond Trust is Bomgar. Did I get that right? I hope I did. It is, right? And Bomgar has the IT side of the house that lets you manage administrative privileges.
They have an application for that, I believe.
Execto. There's another acquisition that happened in there as well. Again, we need this digital signage, right?
You should have a poster or something over here on the wall or something. You could point to the poster.
I think that's why, because basically the quote is that reducing the number of admin users is a necessary step in the foundation to your security strategy.
Sure.
That's one of the solutions they provide, is similarly to what I was speaking before about, was they roll an admin credential on the fly. They create one on the fly, stick it in the admin group, you do your admin thing. When your session ends, that credential goes away.
Right.
Yeah. So it's a really smart way to actually manage I mean, it requires obviously a large project and all that stuff. But
Yep.
I did a briefing with Baumgar before they rebranded as Beyond Trust, I think was what happened, I believe. And I thought that was the coolest part, was the way they managed the admin credentials. I'm like, that makes pen testing much harder.
Yeah, because especially depending on the time between when you capture the credentials and then when you'd want to use those. If those are going to rotate really quickly, then you have to look at the method that was implemented to handle that rotation,
right,
and how that works.
You basically have to now start attacking the technology that is providing credentials for your administrators.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Yep.
The other thing that's really cool that Beyond Trust does is you can set up given admin functions to be doable by a user that has been granted the permission to have that function. So say you got a road warrior, you give them permission to change the network settings, but not go reinstall the OS or tweak it or some of these other things. So
that's a good point.
Takes some of the I've got to have admin to do my job use cases away. And I think following that, that's you can see why they would claim that having admin is where things go wrong, because if you admin the whole box, you could do all kinds of crazy stuff without some limit lines. I like the idea of giving those functions just those functions they need and nothing more.
Yeah, and or limiting the window in which they have those capabilities as well. So
that was
you
the
have
cool
fine-grained, tight control over that, and or you can limit it to a specific small amount of time when you're doing things correctly. Then or when you need to do certain activities. We see that sometimes on the developer side where they claim they need admin rights for certain activities,
and
but
they really don't.
Yeah, and if they're doing things where they might necessarily need admin, that's one thing. But if you're looking at your email and you're browsing the web, in those cases you wouldn't need admin for those activities. And then when you combine that with the phishing attack, where if I drop on the box and I don't have admin rights, then I have to do an escalation to achieve that in terms of my objectives. And that is absolutely something that organizations should do. So that makes a lot of sense.
It's easy for us, I think, to sit here and say that, right? I was actually talking with Casey Ellis of Bug Crowd yesterday, and we got on the subject of how basically you have more access than you need to in a certain instance, and you're just turning on things to make stuff work. And I'm like, I just did this today. And as a security person, I was like, well, that was bad. I need to not use that code anymore, or I'll restrict it later. And I'm like, oh, that's bad. I'm a bad developer, right?
Yep.
But a lot of times, for example, when you're working with an API, and I do a lot of interfacing with APIs to stitch things together, as many of us do, right? And what happens is it's one thing to understand how to write local code and do stuff, but then when you have to interface with someone's API, the code is just one part of it. Understanding how their API works is the other. And so it gets to permissions, and you're like, wow, there's 300 pages of documentation that describe each role and how to grant permissions in this API, and I'm getting an error in my code. I'll just turn everything on and worry about that later. And I can totally see how people fall into that trap. And that's similar to what we're talking about today, is as you restrict, it requires more time to test and understand exactly what roles and permissions people need in a DevOps environment, on a desktop. And that's why most people don't do it. Checkpoint has announced the HALO IoT platform, capturing data and events from connected sensors, specifically in a retail supply chain environment, which is a very hard environment to secure. Checkpoint does have technology that's specifically targeted at this particular use case for retail stores, which I thought was kind of interesting. You think of Checkpoint more as a firewall, next-gen firewall vendor, but they've really got products and put effort into helping secure retail chains. And it's interesting, when I spoke with some retail chains, they were using Checkpoint. I guess it's a thing. So they didn't really describe exactly, I'd love to know what events they're capturing and how they're capturing them and what data they're storing and processing and analyzing and what the end result of that is, what that means to an analyst. It's hard with these press releases to figure that out. But they mentioned machine learning and artificial intelligence.
They used all the right buzzwords.
So then it must be cool.
Must be good, right?
Right. Uh, It's interesting keeping an eye on the IoT stuff on the network these days. I think anything that will help you get some visibility without breaking it is going to be, there's a need.
Yeah, and it's an interesting segue into BlackHat's offering an inside look into Intel Security Engine. It was a very, very brief thing, just trying to entice us to attend BlackHat and learn more about this new technology. They did say low-level firmware attacks are a pernicious problem in security, and the team at Intel will be at BlackHat to look at how their converged security and manageability engine is built to thwart them. I've done some briefings with not so much IoT, but like firmware security companies. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting when I sit with them and like this is what they live and breathe every day. I've done some firmware kind of analysis and we start talking about the potential attack vectors, right? If you think about every server or device that you own, every computer in your environment, and how there's likely some subsystem on there that has some type of firmware. And what happens when an attacker is able to read and write to that firmware, able to store things inside of that firmware, modify, change that firmware? How would you detect that? That's where some of these vendors get into it, and Intel sounds like they're doing similar kind of things. I don't think it's really high up on the radar or priority level for enterprises today, but when we think about being really stealthy in attacks and the gap in visibility, that could be kind of dangerous, I think, but it's not getting a lot of attention.
So it's interesting because you think of the, you covered a lot there with, the firmware level compromise
Mm-hmm.
or corruption style attacks.
Mm-hmm.
Think about like supply chain level of compromise.
Yep.
How would you be able to, you have your supplier, you have your vendor, you have, large enterprise. Would that be even something that could get detected down the road as you deploy inside of whatever environment that is? There's a lot of parts and components.
Yeah. How do you know what's malicious?
How would you know
it's coming into your environment already malicious? That's your baseline.
If I'm the vendor that's supplying the nuts, the bolts that
Mm-hmm.
go into the supply of whatever product or device you're building,
Mm-hmm.
and that component is tampered with or modified or mucked with in some way which would have a negative consequence,
Mm-hmm.
detecting that is going to be potentially really, really challenging or impossible or definitely something that people need to think about. And
we dug into, might have been Eclipsium is the vendor, and we dug into like on the operating system, there's a driver that can interface with it. Primarily they were focused on Intel, ironically enough. Intel firmware, that's how they were reading it and then taking it offline, doing some analysis and saying, is this firmware doing anything malicious? But that same process, if you think about it, when you do an update, like my System 76 systems, the firmware is open on many of their newer systems, which is awesome. It's in a GitHub repository, which is so cool, open source. But there's a facility in the operating system to write that, to update it. Right? So if an attacker gains hold of that process, now they can read and write to subsystems inside of your computers, which I think is really cool. But a problem.
What about
for enterprises.
even, how inclined do you think users are to just click, I'm going to update your firmware, and they'll click, okay, let's do it?
Yeah, it's very true. It's very true. Like you could fake a firmware update and say, hey, there's an update, you need to do this, and it's malicious. The updater's malicious and the firmware is malicious, and it's overwriting that and then gaining persistence on your systems, really. So you wipe the OS, as we've always said.
Yep.
And it just keeps coming back.
It's a nasty persistence if you have that level of compromise.
See, I think today attackers don't really have to go to that level.
Yeah, no.
But I truly believe that there's a cycle where there's going to come a time when a lot of these attacks that we speculate about are going to start becoming more of the norm, because hopefully we've fixed a lot of the other entryways and persistence in enterprises.
Yeah, so
I'm optimistic, I think, but
it's definitely tackling the TTPs or the techniques that an adversary could use inside of your environment, and you're basically forcing them to increase their maturity.
Right.
And as you do that, a TTP could be easy for an attacker or hard for an attacker.
Mm-hmm.
But then on the blue side, it's also could be easy to detect or hard to detect.
Yes, there's
and
like
so
a matrix.
That different matrix And so if it's easy to do from an attacker's perspective, you probably should be covering it sooner. If it's hard from an attacker's perspective, maybe that's a later thing that you should focus on. But yeah, absolutely. There are new TTPs coming out every day, as we've seen with the minor attack release. And so, the firmware level compromise or the firmware level corruption, a lot of enterprises might not necessarily be dealing with that today, but that would change over time potentially. And
it's something.
It's definitely something you need to
have
think
time.
about.
And what I've noticed in the 14 years doing the show is a lot of the academic research or really new attack techniques come out, and you're like, wow, that's really far fetched. And then it's usually like years later, you're like, someone describes an attack that was successful that used that TTP that you read about years ago that came from the academic research, and you're like, oh crap, we got to worry about that now, right? Is it too late? I don't know, maybe. It depends on what type of organization you are.
Yeah.
Most don't have to worry about that, even immediately when we see the first instance of it. Shortly thereafter, when we see the first successful attack with that technique, you're probably going to have to start worrying about it.
Yeah, depending on your vertical and the different APT threat actors that are coming after that vertical. That is, you could take something like the Verizon breach report and do that mapping. And so you have an understanding of this is the vertical that we're in, whether it's retail, in a variety of cases. You basically know your adversary, and with that, what are the common TTPs that fall under that adversary?
Right.
Here are the things that as a vertical they should be concerned with, and then you map that into the program so that you focus and get the most out of your efforts. So,
we're unfortunately out of time. A few more stories in there for our listeners to check out. I want to thank Lee and Josh for participating and appearing on the show. Thank you both. Thank you everyone for listening and watching. We'll see you next time.